Hey folks, welcome back to the DarkHorse Podcast live stream Q&A segment number 56. We are ready to address the burning questions that you have submitted through Super Chat. And if you haven't submitted them yet, you still can.
That's right. You certainly can. I cannot see my computer though, so we don't have any questions. Nope.
We will figure something out. Toot sweet, lickety split.
Well, I got sent, while Zach figures this out, I got sent the Discord question for this week on my phone. So I will look at that first, if I can find it. Nope, that's not where it is.
I think I have to just give your laptop not working screen.
Okay.
It just was.
So here's the Discord question. Here we go. We're going to start with this question this week from the Discord.
Wait, can you see it on the screen now?
Yep, sure can. But still, we're going to start with the Discord question because I pulled it up. In light of the various existential threats that we face, is authoritarianism, regardless of ideology, avoidable? Is there a way to do authoritarianism in a non-ideological, non-tribal way? Governing AI, corporatism, imperial meritocracy, something else. If unavoidable, should we consider ways to do authoritarianism ethically and thoughtfully? P.S. Person asking the question is not pro-authoritarian, just questioning their assumptions.
I think I got it.
Okay.
I think I know what they mean.
Go for it.
So I would draw a distinction between authoritarianism, which is very, very bad, and coercion, which is a necessary evil. But the idea is we should be minimizing the amount of coercion necessary to accomplish things like reaching the collective analysis for things like public safety and public health. So anyway, there's a certain amount of coercion necessary, but basically authoritarianism is coercion first, and a better structure involves recognizing that there are times in which one needs more than the normal amount of coercion. You try to make it temporary, you try to make it as harmless as possible, but in any case, I think that's the answer. Authoritarianism itself is effectively the malignant version of a system of governance in which coercion is playing an important role, which it always is.
Yeah, it must. Good. All right, we're going to answer a few questions from last week's episode before moving on to your questions from last hour, before then moving on to your questions from this hour. My 10-year-old twins like the song on YouTube from American rapper DaBaby, which propagates BLM rioters and demonizes the police. How should I tell them that this is wrong without being patronizing? So I pulled this from last week, but I did not look up the song, so I don't know anything about it. But I don't think we need to address this question. How to talk to your 10-year-olds about them being sucked into an ideology that seems like it's all goodness and light, but really isn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think this the right answer to this question borrows from the approach we took with our own kids from the very beginning, and the approach that we took with college students for a decade and a half. And the answer is that you shoot above people's heads and you allow them to rise to meet you. And so you may have to simplify language a little bit to reach a 10-year-old, but not all that much.
Not too much.
And what I would say, I think, is that there are real problems with policing. And so it seems like by getting rid of the police, you would eliminate those problems, and you would. But the problem is that there's a lot that is produced by policing, even when policing is not good. The benefits of it are effectively invisible. All the crimes that aren't committed because people are afraid that they will be caught by the police and taken away are invisible. They just don't register until you eliminate the police and you discover that what you get is a world of warlords. So I think I would tell the 10-year-old that the problem is it's an overly simple solution, that getting rid of the police seems like a solution to people who've seen abuses of power by the police, but that is only because they haven't seen the alternative, which is worse, and that the solution actually involves fixing policing rather than eliminating it.
Yeah, that's great. I was going to add some things, but I think you did it.
All right.
It seems that you think that BLM and bad science are eating the world. In the real world, though, I don't see it happening. What am I missing? You can't pay the rent with your race or sex. Isn't reality unmovable? So that's, I think that's a coherent set of things, although the individual thoughts there seem to be going all over the place a little bit. But I think the basic question is, in my world, the person asking the question, I'm not seeing the effects of Black Lives Matter or of bad science on my lifestyle, on my career, on anything. I would say that you're lucky, and that many people are, and that whether or not you can see it yet doesn't mean that it's not having the effects that those of us who are seeing it say it does. I feel like you're objecting.
No, I agree. I think I'm having a little trouble imagining how you could miss the hazard of it, given what it is demanding.
Miss the hazard, you said?
Right. I mean, for one thing,
I mean, if it was a totally fringe thing,
right,
and it really was a couple of yahoos, and the mainstream media was actually blowing it out of proportion instead of completely minimizing it, right? Then, yeah, they could be doing exactly the same thing, and if it was 5 people, in a handful of cities, then why are we talking about it so much?
Sure. But, we could, and many did, do the same thing with, the deplatforming that was going on college campuses. And the point was, how serious actually is this? And the answer is it's really goddamn serious. And you can now see that because it's driving murder rates up inside of major cities that are run by democratic administrations, right? So, if death is bad and murder tends to kill people, then it would seem that this is a serious issue because lots of people are no longer walking the earth who presumably would have been, but for this this tantrum.
Yeah, but the last question, excuse me, isn't reality unmovable? Yes, certainly one of the central tenets at the core of what we're talking about is that there is an objective reality out there, whether or not we will ever actually get to it. But the scientific method allows us to sort of approach it as an asymptote. And we never know, we only occasionally will know under certain circumstances how close we actually are to the objective reality that's out there. That said, there is a lot about the human experience that is not directly reflective of the objective reality. And so given that for instance, schools of education, at least in the United States, are pretty well captured by this kind of thinking, and the graduates of those schools will be going out and becoming K-12 teachers, for instance, primary and secondary school teachers, what will it do to a whole generation or whole generations of children's minds who grow up thinking patently untrue things and with no skills in their back pockets with which to determine whether or not what they're saying or thinking is actually reflective of reality? And so, from there, it's a hop, skip, and a jump to we have engineering schools that are encouraging, I don't know if there's actually queering of engineering, but,
It's not a bad rhyme.
Yeah. But God, many episodes ago, we talked about some PhD thesis in an engineering school being defended that was clearly intersectional. And, at the point that bridges start falling down, obviously you have a direct conflict between intersectionality and reality, where civil engineering just can't accommodate this. But there's a whole lot of space between, totally social constructed stuff over here and, does the bridge stand or not? And the vast majority of where most of us spend our time is in some place, hopefully a little bit closer to does the bridge stand or not, but there's still enough interpretation by people of what it means that whether or not their beliefs reflect reality or not actually really does matter.
I also flatly disagree that you can't pay the rent with your race or sex. This is
at this point
this is clearly one of the most actionable items on the demand list. Is they're going to create positions where ostensibly the purpose of the position is to figure out what to do about diversity, equity, and inclusion problems. But of course, the position can only be inhabited by somebody who meets the criteria. And so this is a way of skirting the normal process by declaring something necessary, which then installs
has particular demographic requirements associated with it.
Right. And, we're now seeing this in, with boardroom requirements and all sorts of things. So, yes.
And whole divisions of colleges. I don't know about a majority. A large number and a growing number of colleges and universities, at least in the U.S., have not just sort of departments dedicated to equity and inclusion, but whole divisions of the college. And indeed, this is not the time and place. I'd have to go back and look at the various numbers. But one of the things that happened at Evergreen was exactly the downgrading of academics as one of originally 4 divisions of the college. Yes, academics was only one of 4, but the other 3 were reasonable. There was basically student affairs, which is everything to do with housing and food and clubs and healthcare and all of this, and there was basically finance and administration, all the running of the college that included things like the physical plant. And then there was, I don't remember the names of them, but effectively outreach, PR, right? Which, looked to alums and looked to the public and looked outside for, how it is that you get money that's not coming from the state. So academics, of course, is what the core of a college or university is.
Or should be.
But even in its original formulation at Evergreen, which is just the system we know best, it was only one of 4. Most universities, which are just colleges that have PhD granting authority, they're bigger. There are presumably more divisions than that. But one of the things that the not so hapless, but perhaps intent on destroying the college president at Evergreen did was demoted academics and created 2 new divisions of the college, including one, and again, I don't remember exactly what it's called because I don't have my notes up here right now, but a diversity, equity, and inclusion vice president and all of the staff accompanying that. So whereas before there had been 4 VPs, academics, student affairs, finance and admin or whatever, and public relations or whatever it was called, now there was additionally a VP at the same level for equity and inclusion, which
extremely highly paid with, in the hierarchy of positions, somebody who did not have lots of experience, so somebody who jumped a bunch of levels and was suddenly being paid, $100,000 plus a year.
More than that, but it was a lot of money for Evergreen in particular.
Yeah.
And they needed to staff her entire
right.
And you don't staff those positions either while being blind to things like race and sex, and that's an abomination.
Yeah, and so in that case, that was bridges falling down on the job.
Yeah, that was my line, dude.
Oh, did you say that?
Yeah, well, actually, not bridges falling down on the job. I referred to faculty trolls hiding under bridges.
Yes.
There
you go.
Yes.
So
sorry,
it's a redux, but
but it's different.
Yeah, it's different. So in any case, and the final thing that I would say there is just think back to what we were talking about in the first hour with respect to the University of Chicago and what it's doing to English. That's a career path that is now being explicitly narrowed to people who only espouse one interest and presumably one perspective on it. So anyway, yes, you can very definitely pay the rent with this stuff, and that's a hazard to everything else that should be rewarded.
Yep. Next question from episode 55. How can one combat claims that all regularly occurring climate events such as wildfires are related to man-made climate change without coming off as a denier? To this, I would just say I looked back and figured out which episodes we actually talked about this in. It was episodes 44 and 45 back when we were enduring, basically smoke lockdown, the smokeopolis in the Pacific Northwest that had Portland having the worst air quality in the world there for 8 or 10 days. So we specifically talked about what fraction of the wildfires and their intensity was being attributed to anthropogenic climate change by the really careful people who were not just stating, having planted a flag either in everything is climate change or nothing is climate change, who were really trying to figure out what it was. And as I remember in this particular case, the intensity in both the increase in number and the intensity of the fires that are happening in the Pacific Northwest being somewhat different range from some of the other Western biomes in which fires are happening was something like a third, I think, 30 to 40, or maybe 30 to 50% is what it was, which is both substantial and not everything. And that's exactly what it is, right? This is, yes, based on models, and we have questioned the models before, but so many models point to that kind of nuanced understanding of what is going on. And that is a broad enough span that I sit pretty confidently with those numbers.
Yeah, and I would just point back to the first hour also. This is another one of these things that even a good education tends to lack now. So on the same list with population versus individual level thinking and collective action problems, there is a basic lack of understanding of how to process complex, noisy systems and how to understand them and to recognize pattern in them. And, we are forever tripping over the fact that you can't prove that a given event has such a cause, but you can deduce that it's likely that it does.
Exactly.
So anyway, that is something to be upgraded in our educational structure too, if we ever decide to rebuild it.
That would be great. Yeah. And I don't remember if I said it. So that was episodes 44 and 45 where we talked about this somewhat as well. A comment that I appreciated, so I thought I'd read it. Thanks to both of you for what you do to counter those who would tell others to sit down and shut up. Thank you for standing up for language and science and liberty. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Stand up and shut down instead. Or, I don't know.
Oh, latter-day Timothy Leary, you're not.
I'm working on it. It's a prototype.
Yeah. What talents are not well represented on a resume? What new heuristics would you like to see standardized that could expand access to white-collar jobs? I am passionate about helping underdogs compete. So this is a great question to which I did not actually think through what the answers might be, but it's something that I think we should return to perhaps at some length. But do you have something off the top of your head here?
Yep, I do.
Great.
I fear that I may be borrowing it from David Kelly, the Stanford professor and engineer that I think I mentioned once before.
Yeah.
And if I'm not borrowing it from him, then I'm sure it's something he'd agree with. But it is the meaning. If you encounter somebody who has a habit of tinkering, right? Somebody who constructs little mechanisms or takes things apart and fixes them, troubleshoots them. Such a person tends to be very capable of navigating all kinds of systems that are, not explicit. In other words, an ability to open up a machine that isn't working and troubleshoot, hypothesis test, all the things you need to do in order to get it to possibly work, tends to be good in all kinds of situations where those skills are also valuable. So,
and where if you have not succeeded, you cannot argue with the thing in question and convince it that you have succeeded. Right. The physical reality of the system trumps the social reality of what you want to be true.
Yes, although there's one caveat buried under that, which is, this was very much my experience as a kid tinkering, and then I later read Feynman say almost exactly the same thing about his experience as a kid, which is that very often if you take something apart, and when you take apart almost anything complex these days, you don't understand how it works.
You're looking at circuit boards rather than levers.
Right. And even if it's levers, the stuff is often so complex that it's hard to track, right? But it doesn't mean there's not a lot you can deduce about what's inside. But here's the funny odd fact, which is you've got some object that doesn't work. You take it apart looking for a problem. Sometimes you can spot it. Sometimes you can't. But if you just work on the skill of taking it apart without losing anything and taking it apart so you don't destroy anything and so you can get it back together, very frequently on putting it back together, it does work. And so the lesson that I derive from this is that something will be out of place, and the logical ability to put things back where it seems they must go, because almost always there's only one place each part could go, short of a screw or something like that.
Yeah.
There's only one place each part could go. And so just simply learning to take things apart and put them back together without doing any harm actually allows you to fix a bunch of things. So it's not like you've convinced it to work, but you did fix it without fully deducing what was not working about it.
Exactly. You did not, you made it functional without doing the diagnostics or without successfully doing the diagnostics, even though you were interested in doing so. But this also reveals something about the nature of physical systems, which is that things wear, things slide slightly out of place, and that those two observations, things wear, things slide out of place, are not the complete solution set to why that will work. But it certainly is going to be some of the times, right? Like you just have something with a lot of moving parts, or parts that are moving but aren't supposed to be moving. Take them apart, you put them back in securely, add lubrication where there should have been some and there wasn't, take out the lubrication where it had gotten where it doesn't belong, and you put it back together, and voila. Okay, I don't know what it was that was sliding when it shouldn't, sticking when it shouldn't, slightly in the wrong place, had slipped, etc. But it looks like, given that it's working now, that is probably going to have been the case. And then you can continue. You can track, like, okay, does it fail again in the same way within a week, a month, never? Is the piece in question of the larger functional system itself about to fail such that you can't make it work by putting it back together? Or was it just loose? Is it just something that happened that doesn't need to be understood for you to move forward with a functional system?
Absolutely. But even just the skill of opening something and putting it back together without doing harm to it trains the mind. It's surprisingly hard. Yeah. Right? There are lots of things, like once they're open, you see how they were supposed to be opened, but you can't see that there was a little tab that you were supposed to, push or something like this without breaking it. So, sometimes you do. When I was a kid, my rule was, if it's broken, then I'm licensed to take it apart because I'm not going to make it worse. Right? And so
is that a rule that you shared with your parents?
I think so. I mean, the point is, it was an obvious rule because it was stuff that was headed to the trash.
I mean,
anyway.
It sounds like a reasonable rule. It just also sounds like the kind of rule that at least some parents, I don't think yours, would have objected to, just on the basis that it sounds like you're going to start justifying that it's kind of broken. It's almost broken. Well, hey, look, it's broken.
I mean, this was the 70s and 80s. There was a lot of broken gizmos around, and a person could spend a lot of time on them. Yeah. But I do wonder, there are a lot of things that train the mind, right? And there's presumably diminishing returns on this, right? If you train the mind all in one way, then you get less of an effective mind than if you had two such exercises. But if you took some fraction, if you took half of some college, and instead of putting them through the coursework of all of the philosophy and English and math and science that they were otherwise going to take, and you had them take stuff apart for every hour that they would have spent on other things, there'd be some stuff missing from that education, to be sure. Would they, in the end, come out with a more agile mind, better able to pick up the stuff that they didn't catch that they actually need? In other words, how would it compare head to head? Would you get smarter people out the other end?
To which I would add, and this is the road down which you end up with a two-full curriculum. But to which I would add representative art and craft. Some version of creating a product in the universe that is recognizable or useful, recognizable as the thing which you wanted it to be recognizable as, if you're making representative art, or useful in some way. And music has to fit in there somewhere, but I don't know exactly how it fits in this particular rubric. So that is another sort of thing that everyone should have, something creative, artistic, craftsman-like in their quiver of arrows, whether or not they understand or can explain why it is that this will be useful in some white-collar job. And then also outdoor exploration, including sport, wherein you are interfacing there are a lot of team sports that most people have no interest in playing, and I did play some team sports growing up. I played volleyball, but Ultimate is the one that we both came to in grad school and played a ton of, and that allows you to interface both with the physical world and with the social nature of a team, and with competitors and with collaborators. And so, it really does just bring out a ton of remarkable skills that, there's a reason that you're allowed to put that sort of thing on a resume, even if nobody exactly knows what it's there for.
Yeah, I agree with your additions. And I like that you said representative art. Not that that's the only valid kind,
of course.
But it is possible to fake your way through art
Yep.
if you are not required to demonstrate an ability to, cause the mind to think it's looking at a three-dimensional object or something
Right.
like this. And
In terms of 2D and 3D art, I think it does need to be representative. Sorry, I interrupted.
Or you have to have that skill. It's not to
Yeah.
say that the higher value might not come from something abstract, but the part that trains the mind for sure
Yeah.
is the part that causes you to say, well, I have a 3D model of what I'm seeing. How can I create a 2D rendering that causes the person who's looking at it to have the experience
to
of seeing it?
recognize that that's what I was trying to do.
Right.
So that it's basically the social check on whether or not your understanding of the universe is accurate by some measure. Similarly, craft, be it weaving or pottery or woodworking or any metalworking, any number of things, there is a result that not everyone will love, but is beautiful by some standards and functional, and it either is or it isn't.
Right, which I think is why museums are full of still lifes, right? It's not that a bowl of fruit is such an awesome subject full of meaning, but the point is...
It's a bowl of fruit, right?
Well, we know what it's supposed to look like.
Yeah.
Hey, I don't even know if this is true. All right, you art people, you're going to tell me, right? There's something about a bowl of fruit, at least before the invention of photography, where... if you can render a bowl of fruit, you are painting at a certain rate, right? Either you're doing it before the fruit melts in the bowl, right?
Sure.
Or your memory is really good, and
Yeah.
that's another extraordinary skill. And so in some sense, you practice on something like this that isn't permanent, and basically it sets a higher standard for what you're achieving.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know if either you or I have really spent much time with art history, but I wonder if that's not been proposed somewhere in what a still life is about. So, it's just still landscape. It's a little bit of that with seasonality and such, but no, your description of before the fruit melts in the bowl
Right.
is really vivid. I think
Yeah.
that's right. That's good.
I'll be curious to see what we get back on that.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the questions from last hour. Time is running short. The failure of our education system is the problem from which all other issues arise. There needs to be an IDW-style meeting of the minds to come up with a plan to fix education, get venture capital, start small, grow, please. So I only rank ordered these and have not had time to read any of them between our live streams today, so I did not realize that I'd put that appropriately right after the previous one. So I feel like we've just talked about some of the ways that education could be fixed. I agree. Time is running short. I do feel like 20 years ago, neither you nor I would have thought that we would become educators precisely, right? We were scientists. I specifically also thought of myself very much as a writer, explorers, adventurers, and perhaps academics, but educators not so much. And we became that quite explicitly and quite wholeheartedly at Evergreen, and came, I think, in so doing, to really understand a lot about what is wrong and what can be done, much of which maybe cannot be done with the current system. So much of the best of what we could do at Evergreen required extended periods of time and the ability to deep dive with people. And that's hard to scale. It's probably impossible to scale into like an 800-person class. And it probably doesn't work if you're jumping from class to class every 50 minutes.
Yes. And then there is the gigantic horsefly in the ointment of trying to start something that even worked at the right scale, which is that if you, and we both think, and we in fact worked for a year on a project to see if there was a way in. There is a way to fix education. It would be hard to do worse than we're doing, and you could do much better, much cheaper if you just simply took the word of the relatively small fraction of the faculty that actually succeeds in reaching people and upgrading their minds. But the problem is, were you to try to do it and escape all of the garbage that has taken out now 100% of American higher ed institutions, right? Were you to try to do that, then what you are is either going to try to get accredited, and you're going to go down the same rabbit hole as these other things have, or you're not going to be accredited. And now you're up against the question of what is this unaccredited, is it snake oil? Is it this? Is it that?
Right.
So I think this is the perfect moment for that, because at some level, the bankruptcy of the mainstream system is now becoming relatively widely recognized, and the expense of it is so stupidly out of proportion to what you get that, if ever there was a moment at which people might say, yeah, screw it, I don't care if it's unaccredited, it's high quality, right? If there was ever a moment for that, this would be it. But nonetheless, even to the point of view of, well, you're going to start an educational institution and it's not going to have an edu domain or edu email addresses. It's not going to be eligible for funding from the federal government through the same mechanisms because of the lack of accreditation. So accreditation is that thing that you plug your educational institution into to make sure that it gets its lobotomy. And if you want to avoid it, you pay one set of costs. If you want to embrace it, you'll pay the other. And it's doable, but the system is a problem.
Yep. Next question. Would you please make time to talk about ancient female big game hunters at the beginning of your next live stream? Yes. Apologies. We've talked about doing it twice now and haven't gotten to it. I'll put it at the top of the docket for next time.
Yeah, we've got to talk about that before it comes back into fashion.
You think?
Female big game hunting?
You're worried?
A little.
I'm not.
Okay.
Here we have a link to something that I at least haven't seen. Why from lockdownskeptics.org, The Future Shape of Things. Our friend Jim Lindsay posted on Twitter. So we'll take a look and see if we have any thoughts next week. Next question. Heather, a while ago, I think you had previously stated something to the effect of, quote, societies that produce weak males will often produce aggressive females. Obviously not a direct quote, but can you expand on that? Well, I don't remember saying that, but I don't disagree. I mean, I think the opposite, well, there's a causality here that is the only thing that is potentially not right. That I think if you have a society that has weak members of either sex, you're going to have strong members of the other sex, and that doesn't imply causation. Weak females in a society are probably going to be correlated with aggressive, strong males, and weak males probably correlated with aggressive females, but producing aggressive females, maybe I might actually put the causality backward, the other way around here as well, that as you have more and more, frankly, male typical style of aggression among women, that interestingly, many men are more and more likely to step down and to because they're being threatened at some level, because they're being told that this is no longer their time and they're not allowed on the stage anymore. And of course, as we've talked about many times, this ends up making men weak. And of course, the women who are often arguing that they need men to step down and get off the stage and all of this don't want weak men. And so this leaves men who have been followed some path that they thought was the right one, left with very few options. And it's not through no fault of their own. It's partially their fault. They made choices, but you just shouldn't buy it when people claim that what they want is weakness in their partners, weakness in their potential partners, and that's not what anyone wants. And there's a kind of docility that some men may want in some women, but I would say women, those aren't the men you want. And there is, it's just even hard to imagine what world any men are imagining that has women admiring and wanting to be with life with, spineless men. Just, there's no historical precedent for this. Right.
No, it won't work. I would add one thing to this, which is the dimorphism in males and females has resulted in legal asymmetries, which are justified by the fact that women are actually vulnerable to men in a way that is not typically the reverse. Mm-hmm. So those legal advantages that go to women, which are compensatory, can also be abused. And so one of the things that we are seeing is that women who are willing to make use of the protections of women as an offensive weapon are wielding it, which is causing men to be at the very least, incoherent, because they can't just simply depend on the fact that if they're decent, they're not vulnerable. If accusations, in a world where we're debating what believe all women means, or believe women, does it mean believe all women, and who does that empower? You've got weapons that are not secured being wielded against people that somebody wants to do damage to, and it doesn't always result in the right people being punished. So again, it suggests that the causality being reversed here, I think, is likely. Yeah,
and I would argue that the weaponization. Boy, you said something there that I really wanted to respond to. I've now lost it. Okay, we'll move on. I can't remember. I'd like to come back to it. I'm going to make this in color here. There we go. Do you have thoughts on this Frank Herbert paraphrase? Scratch a conservative and you find a person who prefers a certain past to an uncertain future. Scratch a liberal and you find a closet aristocrat. I've never heard that before. The first part sounds right, and I think most conservatives would grant that. Scratch a conservative and you find a person who prefers a certain past to an uncertain future. The second half, scratch a liberal and you find a closet aristocrat. I don't immediately see how that is true. What do you think?
Well, I was going to say the same thing, that the first part of this seems clearer than the second part. I think what the second part is about is that liberalism has traditionally had a valence of fighting for the underdog. And so it's supposed to collect underdogs and combine them with people who are advocating for their interests. So to the extent that one aspires to be an aristocrat, but you're not in a position to do it, things like redistribution are appealing. And so I think the problem I have with it is that if you scratch some liberals, you will find closet aristocrats. No doubt about that. But I don't think it's inherent to it.
Yeah, good. That makes sense. And I thought of the other thing I just wanted to add to our conversation there about strong women and weak men being coincident in society, which is that you bring up the weaponizing of important legal rights that women have because of sexual dimorphism. And very often when anyone, men or women, talk about the weaponization of those rights by some women, we are told that we are being misogynist, that we are acting as if we don't care about women. And I would say, actually, that's exactly 100% wrong. That it is those women who would weaponize the laws that have been put in place to protect women on account of the fact that we are, on average, smaller and have less muscle mass, who are themselves the misogynists. So they are working against the interests of all the rest of women and all the good men out there as well. That is the misogynistic position, not us criticizing them doing so.
So I totally agree with that. And I'm imagining a deep fake in which you and I talking about this is same set and everything, but we're gorillas having this conversation, which frankly, you can imagine reasonable gorillas having this conversation.
I've imagined you as a gorilla, sure.
Well, sure. Why not? But I mean, it's a fine and interesting great ape, and the dimorphism is rather profound.
Rather the most polygynous, right? And for those who aren't familiar with the languaging here, polygyny is the very particular type of polygamy. Polygamy is the term that's usually used, but it always is actually, in common parlance, a stand-in for polygyny, meaning a mating system in which one male monopolizes the reproductive effort of lots of females.
Right. But the investment is high on the part of silverback males. But anyway, I just think it would be funny, in some ways I find gorillas more human than chimps.
Yeah.
There's a humanness about them that's more relatable in some ways. But
they keep the peace more frequently as well.
Right.
Frankly.
No, I think they're more peaceable, to be sure, by a lot.
Something to do with having to spend so much of their day eating leaves. Actually, it is going to be diet related, not just mating system, social system.
I think that's true.
Yeah.
But anyway, I do think it would make this very conversation, the point would be all the more effective.
If I were also 50% smaller than you, for instance.
Well, right, exactly. But, the fact that you could have this conversation and that, two people who are interested in the analysis could arrive at the same conclusion, even though the disadvantage, were you to weaponize it, would be, substantial. So anyway, we'll see. The future may have the DarkHorse Podcast Guerrilla edition.
All right. This is a recommendation, I think. Netflix's Babylon Berlin has been amazing to watch and draw parallels to regarding America right now and pre-Nazi Germany. Communist riots followed by national backlash. Love to know what you draw from it. Much love from New Zealand. I don't even know of it. We haven't watched it. Have you heard of this?
I've not heard of the series. I've heard this parallel drawn. And so anyway, I'm very interested to the extent that there is such a series. It's worth us looking into.
Yeah. I've heard both of you correctly criticize the U.S. voting process, but to what degree do you think the current undermining by Trump will irrevocably pull voters out of elections and or nudge us towards separatist parties?
Well, that's a tough one.
Yeah. So two different possible outcomes.
As you've heard me say, the unity movement was very concerned about this on the front end before we had a division over how fair the election had been. And I do believe that the solution involves us coming up with some system that is modern and robust, which would arise out of the recognition that we all benefit from such a system. And the problem is, frankly, I think these parties like cheating. And, I'm not saying
Both
anything about, of course, it's what they do. And that, I'm not talking about the balloting itself, but the point is, I think there is a reflexive desire to keep the system, baroque, because frankly, people are, itching to gain their advantage in a court fight over hanging chads or whatever it is. And really, the fact is, a lot of these people don't believe in democracy as a system. They like it as camouflage. And those of us who do think that the consent of the governed is the sole basis for the legitimacy of government have to reassert structures that will allow us to figure out what the public wants, even when the public wants something that we at a lower level think is bad, right? The process either works or it doesn't. And those of us who believe that it works better than the alternatives have to fight for it. Now, I will say, you have to compare the hazard of a modernized system. In other words, a bad modernized system would be almost certainly more prone to fraud versus a really well thought out modernized system. So it's not like modern is inherently better in this case. Modern could very easily be worse, but good modern compared to our completely bizarre and highly irregular and variable system, that system is clearly prone to error. And if you were going to hide something, hiding it in a complex phenomenon rather than a place where you could track individual patterns is obviously a problem.
Yeah. Also, you had a gem hidden in there, as is so often the case. You produce these phrases that should be lasting, which is that you said that both parties are wearing democracy as camouflage, that they like to pretend.
Yes, they do.
To be democratic, but that it is a useful feint to direct attention to the democracy-sounding stuff and obscure what's going on behind the scenes.
Yep, such is the nature of duopoly.
Mm-hmm. You are at about 44 minutes. Oh boy. We're going to read a few more from here and then move to the following hour. What are the chances that you'll get Ed Snowden on the DarkHorse Podcast? Second part of the question, do you think he should be pardoned? Yes, I think he should be pardoned.
I agree. Ed Snowden should absolutely be pardoned. Mm-hmm. Would love to have him on the podcast. Also believe that Assange should be pardoned. Mm-hmm. And I hope that Trump will do these things on the way out of office.
Yep. Also, after COVID, if so, same person asking the question, new question. Also, after COVID is over, would you be open to hosting small group educational trips for people like us to places of biological interest like you did with your students?
That's a crazy idea.
Yeah. So, we've been talking about that for a number of years. And in fact, part of the reason for us to go down to Patini, this extraordinary biological research station in the heart of the Ecuadorian Amazon in January of 2020 of this year, was to assess whether or not it would be really accessible, whether or not it would be at all plausible to take people there. And I think, the short answer is probably. The experience of showing people deep nature that they have only seen represented in animations or highly curated nature documentaries in the past is really such a joy, and being able to do so along with an education about what the evolutionary processes that you're observing the results of mean is even more fun. So I think we might.
Yeah. It's the best, and we should. It's easier for me to say because Heather has gotten the logistics down to a science, and the logistics are not fun.
Yeah.
So it's a tremendous amount of work.
The logistics that I'd gotten down to the science were with the help of an admittedly small and somewhat incompetent college, but they took care of, for instance, all the legal parts of it.
Insurance.
Right. Yeah. So I just had to make sure that I and all my students were in compliance. I didn't have to source anyway. So it's more complicated than it might seem, but possibly, yes. Hi, this is my first super chat, but I've been here since the beginning. Could you speak about the new research on hyperbaric oxygen therapy and the increase in length of telomeres? Thanks to you all for all you do.
Yeah, I'm barely aware of this. I'm highly skeptical of the actual utility. In other words, I may be wrong, but what I think I read is that they are using these oxygen-enriched chambers and discovering that telomere lengthening is occurring. Now, it is a stretch, though, to infer that this is going to create a reversal of the senescence pattern, and for various reasons. One of them, I argued in my paper, which ultimately came out in, was it 2002? It's 2002, that one of the key features that was causing aging, I called it histological entropy. I should have called it epigenetic entropy. Did not yet understand how that term would change. But in any case, the point is that cells trigger different subsets of their genomes. They encode different proteins at different stages in their life cycle, and that the proper encodings are triggered by information about where a cell is that it gets from its neighbors, and the path that a cell has taken to become what it is as it has become more and more narrowly specified. And the problem is, as you lose cells from a mature system and they are replaced by other cells, the information on which the cell bases its estimation of which genes it is supposed to transcribe becomes lower and lower quality. In other words, the organization of the epigenetic information becomes noisy. And as it becomes noisy, cells are doing less of it, tissues are doing less of a good job because the cells within them are not well organized relative to each other. And there's no way that enriching oxygen introduces any information into the system about what genes to transcribe. So at the very least, if this works, it doesn't work on the core problem, if I'm right about what the core problem is. And it remains to be demonstrated that there's anything useful about the telomere elongation that's being measured. In fact, there's a way, again, I'm talking about a paper I haven't deeply read, but there's a way in which that could be an artifact and not really a measure of anything.
The paper you haven't deeply read being the hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
Correct.
Zach just quickly put this up. Yeah, so this is your paper with Debbie from 2002.
Yeah, and I think the Histological entropy is even,
It's right there.
entropy and histological entropy, which again, if I had it to do over, I would call epigenetic entropy. The meaning is the same.
I always loved histological entropy as not as a process so much.
Right.
I liked it more back then when I was younger.
Right. Exactly.
But I think it's a great phrase. But I understand why you would rather it be epigenetic entropy. It makes more sense.
I think
you're talking. It's more fundamental. It's earlier in the pathway.
Well, I think it was misinterpreted. I think the term, so there are a lot of bad hypotheses of senescence based on entropy, right? People have noticed, the body gets more chaotic over time.
I actually it hadn't occurred to me that was the problem.
So I think people read it as a kind of, another one of those garbagey arguments. And the answer is no, this is a very specific argument about information. Where is that information? It's epigenetic information. Okay. And so I will say I have noticed.
And it manifests in the histological tissues perhaps, but
Right. That's it is histological. There's nothing wrong with the term in terms of its meaning. It's wrong in terms of what I think people read it to mean. But I know that David Sinclair at Harvard has picked up this thread. It's an important part of his argument. So anyway,
I don't know him. I don't recognize the name.
He's a senescence researcher. He's been on various podcasts that we know and things.
Okay.
So anyway.
I have a cousin who believes that men have periods and believes that your videos are transphobic. Please steelman the argument for this and give scientific argument against.
Steelman the argument that we're transphobic?
Well, steelman the argument that men have periods. So, we have been consistent and clear that we do not think that trans is a fiction. We know trans people. We count trans people among our friends. And we understand that while sex is effectively a binary, going back to the anisogamy of two very different gamete types that in our lineage is 500 million years old at least, uninterrupted, that the manifestation of individual bodies with regard to what sex they are more complex and therefore some can be somewhat messier, and that there can be a disconnect between, say, your actual sex, which is to say, the gametes that you produce, and your chromosomal sex, which in mammals and birds is determining what sex you are, and your anatomical and physiological sex, like the primary and secondary sex characteristics that are revealed on your body, and also endocrinologically, and then also the sex of your brain. And this is where things get more and more fuzzy. Male and female brains are on average different in some regards. I can't remember which way it goes, but I should look it up, but one sex of brain tends to have more white matter, and one sex of brain tends to have more gray matter, for instance. So there are average differences with, yes, ton of overlap between them, but it is quite possible, given the complexity and length of development, for signals to get mixed, and for someone to be an actual male, for instance, with a brain that feels so female that it is irreconcilable for them to live as a male. And so basically for their feeling of their own sex in their brain to be not the sex that they are, and therefore to live their best life, to live as the sex that they are not, and therefore to be, trans. To be nice, to be respectful. I am fine calling a person, I guess I've used the wrong example, but someone who is actually female, who thinks who really feels in their brain that they need to live as a man, that trans man will continue to have periods, probably. Frankly, if they're continuing to have periods, they probably aren't fully transitioned, because once you're on testosterone, you probably are not continuing to have periods, although I don't know enough about the various endocrinological things to know that for sure. I would not call such a person a man. They're not a man. They're a trans man, and that is a sign of respect, and I'll be happy to use he, him pronouns with such a person. But at base, that person is a biological female, because biological females are the people who have periods, not men.
All right. So I agree with what you said. I tracked it very carefully. I think we can say it very simply.
Great. Let's do it.
Okay. So what I would say is trans is a real phenomenon. It is an ancient phenomenon. It is one that we see in many different cultures. There are allowances for such things and the expectation that they will happen.
Sorry. So I'm going to have you go back and do this briefly again, but let me just interrupt right there and say, we in fact know that trans is not just real and ancient, but has many different causes. It's actually multiple things. So for instance, there's a small population in, I think it is Haiti, with what is now understood to be a very real genetic variant that produces transness, such that the rate of trans people in this one village in Haiti is sky high compared to, every place else, where it's a tiny fraction of 1%. So I think that genetic variant is unknown in the rest of the world, for instance. But so, in this particular part of Haiti, trans is understood to be caused by a particular genetic variant.
Unknown and no reason to believe it exists.
Right.
In other words, it's not typically caused by genes as far as we know.
Yeah. Okay, so
by some genetic variant.
Start again with your brief explanation here.
Trans is ancient, natural, and there are allowances for it in many cultures as a result. When a person is trans, they arrive there by self-designation, by reporting features of their personality that would tell us that their mind feels more female even though their body is male. And in such a case, the right thing to do is to treat them as a man for some intents and purposes. And that's the point. It's not all intents and purposes. That's why we are fighting over the term man, right? What intents and purposes? Well, let's just say loosely social, insofar as it doesn't cause a bigger problem somewhere else. They're not a man from the point of view of a karyotype, from the point of view of their doctor, right? They are a man from the perspective of social interaction and our treatment. And then we run into, again, places where we can't be so simple about it when we get to sexed bathrooms, sports, prison, other things where we actually have to make a call and the answer is not simple, right? So anyway, this is my...
Houses for survivors of domestic violence.
Sure.
Like there is a reason for non-symmetrical protections for women under the law. There is a reason for women to have spaces which men cannot enter. And this is an obvious potential way to game that. And we know that even though the vast majority of people who are actually trans would never be doing that it has happened.
Right. So the simple version, the Steelman version, is trans is natural. That means that there are people who are born female who transition to male who may continue to have periods, and they should be treated as men where practical, right? But not everything. That's where we part ways with the idea that men can have periods, because that's absurd. Period is a biological phenomenon. There's a reason that it strikes the mind as inconsistent to hear that, and the mind is not incorrect to register that inconsistency. So,
it's go on.
How do we know that we are not transphobic? Because we've just told you, A, that we've had many trans students, that we get on well with them, that we regard trans as a natural and ancient phenomenon that cultures have incorporated for, thousands of years. And how could we possibly be transphobic if that's what we're saying? That doesn't mean we're not wrong about stuff, but it's in the idea that we are somehow hostile to transness is...
No, I think that's being too generous. Transphobia is a term that doesn't mean what it seems to mean. Actual transphobia, which I haven't exactly run into, would be it's not real at all. There is no way to be thinking about anyone being trans. I don't even know what it would sound like, honestly. So I'm not even sure I think that the word has any meaning honestly, outside of the trans rights activists who use it as a weapon. It's used as a bludgeon and so almost anyone who is wielding the term transphobia at this point, I would say, no, you are reality phobic. I'm not transphobic. You are reality phobic. Let us lay out for you what is actually true and where the points are that we could reasonably disagree. And if you really believe that a period, which is the result of a failed fertilization of an egg event, which is as fundamentally female a process as can possibly be, is something that could be happening in a male body, then you need a better education. We don't need to admit that we're transphobic. You need to admit that you're reality phobic.
I think you nailed it.
Okay.
All right.
Do you know who Joel Kotkin is?
I don't think so.
I don't either. Joel Kotkin, we are told, has done quite a bit on Neo-Feudalism, that big tech act as oligarchs, income inequality is high, and social mobility is low. Do you have thoughts? From that brief blurb, sounds potentially right, but neither of us know the name.
Yeah, I would say, Neo-Feudalism is going to be like fascism, where there are going to be elements of it all over the place, and the ones you point to here in this question certainly are worthy of asking this question, but you're not going to find all of the elements. So maybe by calling it neo-feudalism, you rescue yourself from that predicament. But yeah, there's definitely some analogy to be made. It's going to fall apart the finer grained you get.
Okay, just one more quick question, because I doubt you will answer it, but I think we should read it before we move to this hour's questions. For a little bit anyway. You talked about a video that was pulled from YouTube in a few hours. What is the title and where is it available?
I don't remember the title, actually. I don't.
Well, I mean, I could presumably find it if you wanted to share it, but part of the conversation that we had was about whether or not we actually, I mean, amazingly, bizarrely, that we live in this world right now, feel that we can talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you think? If I find it, which I'm about to be able to do here, I think in my notes.
Here's why I don't want to do it.
Okay. That's what I thought.
First of all, I think you probably find it from what we've said, but.
There's a few out there.
There's a couple. Yeah.
There's a few.
What I would like to do, I believe that our responsibility, and I don't believe that this is a requirement of our contractual interaction with Google, such as it is, but I believe that the moral requirement, given who we are and what we do, is that we present this material in context, and we do some work to make it clear why certain claims, why the claims have the status that they do, right? And so anyway, I would like to figure out that this is safe enough to engage in, and to engage in it properly. I don't think we're going to be able to establish that, Google's not going to tell us it's safe. So we're going to have to take the risk. But I would like not to, wow, that's a lot of barking. I would like not to set people to looking at this. Some people will have tools to evaluate it, but others will not. And I think to the extent that we are bringing attention to it, we should bring attention with the proper tools to figure out what it means.
Good. Okay. I do not have a line here to tell me where the new hour's questions start, and our producer has just gone to quiet the dog. I think I'm on it, Zach. You're back now, huh? I think this is the first question of the next hour. Science is the best tool to find out how the world is, including in social science. We can make descriptive claims about the objective and subjective, no anti-positivism or interpretivism. What do you think? Much love.
Yeah. I mean, at some level, that sounds like an audacious claim, but the thing is, this is the basic essence of figuring out what's true. It's the best mechanism we have. And that's not to say that it doesn't need upgrading. I have argued many times that we have gotten much better at figuring out what's true in the context of the simple sciences. Simple sciences not being easy sciences. Sometimes they're much harder. But
fundamental sciences is usually what you say.
Fundamental sciences, yeah. Physics, chemistry, we've done a really good job of figuring out to a high degree of certainty and specificity how things work. We are much earlier in the process of figuring out complex systems, especially complex adaptive systems, and there is a philosophical alteration you need to make to the scientific method and its context in order to do complex systems well. But that said, there are patterns. That's the only thing that we can notice, that we can discuss. Figuring out how those patterns work requires a method. We don't have a better method, nor is there any reason to think that there is a better method than fundamentally a scientific approach in which you attempt to falsify hypotheses, and that which is left standing after all such attempts is the model that we continue forward with. So, basically the answer to your question, I think, is yes.
All right, next question. How did concealed ovulation evolve? This is from Echo. Did we move from males selecting for females for fertility, women historically having few ovulations, to females selecting for males? Does concealed ovulation imply more male competition? So just to knock off a little bit of the low-hanging fruit here, does concealed ovulation imply more male competition? No, I think it implies exactly as the previous question in this line of thinking suggests, that you now have that you basically now have choice going both directions, and that effectively when it's clear from the outside, when males can tell when a female is at her most fertile, she is more easily controlled by males who have an interest in controlling the reproductive periods and just reproductive capacity of females. And so, this goes back to, the classic paper on the evolution of mating systems, Emlyn and Oring from 1977, which may even be called the evolution of mating systems. Mating systems being those things that describe, are you in a monogamous society where you have one female to one male, polygynous, one male to multiple females, polyandrous, one female to multiple males, or so-called promiscuous, which in modern human terms we would call polyamory, sort of a free-for-all. So all of those are known mating systems, polygyny being by far the most common among mammals, monogamy being next most common, and polyandry and promiscuity being very, very rare. Monogamy is pretty rare as well. But in a traditional system, you have males competing in a polygynous system, you have males competing between amongst each other for access to females, and females in most situations get to choose. And as you move more and more towards monogamy, you have competition within both sexes for access to the other sex, and also choice by both sexes of the other sex. And as one of the ways that females, physiologically, with no conscious choice at all, of course, involved, can effectively move a system away from polygyny towards monogamy, which is good for almost everyone except a few very powerful males, is to make their own reproduction less controllable by males. And how do you make it less controllable? You make it less obvious, you make it less discernible. So concealment of ovulation is one way, obviously, to make your fertile period less obvious. What is the mechanism? I have no idea.
Well, let me again try to. I think that's a plus lesson in this set of questions, but it's going to be hard to follow. But if you think about it this way, males have an evolutionary incentive to try to dominate the reproductive output of as many females as they can. And if you imagine a system in which males are able to spot when females are fertile, which is true in most creatures, a powerful male will move from one female to the next at her fertile period and fertilize each of them and basically fend off competing males. So to prevent that, a system evolves, in this case, the invisibility, so that a male who attempted that might succeed in mating with, but would not necessarily succeed in fertilizing. Therefore, the best male strategy, even for a powerful male, will be to invest in an individual female so that he has sex with her when she's fertile, even if neither of them know when that is. And so, anyway, I would say it's a very positive thing. And I agree with your point about control, that to the extent that this was concealed to the outside world, but not to the woman herself, then coercion might force a woman to cough that information up, which would then reinstitute the system in which powerful males had the ability to fertilize many females. And the downside of that.
Well, and there is, whenever I talked about this in classrooms, I would have a few young women saying, I kind of know. And I think, there is a kind of no in terms of sort of peak fertility for a lot of women, but it's still nowhere close to obvious the way it is in all of our primate relatives.
It's not close, and it's also not precise. In other words, we're talking about a number of hours, and the fact of having a general sense of when it is not the same thing as knowing when you're fertile.
Yeah.
Also, I would say that we moderns know a tremendous amount more about things like fertility and how long these periods are. And so to the degree that there is some detectable thing, it is also embedded in a system in which a woman knows that there's something to look for, right?
It's based on extant metrics.
Right. And so anyway, yes, I got the same pushback on that point every time. And I think it means less than people imagine that it does. But in any case, bottom line message here is that there's a fascinating, I would say mating systems is one of the places that evolutionary biology has done reasonably well, that we have understood a great deal about this. And, it owes a lot to Emlyn and Oring and their, initial foray into
one of these
this.
Just brilliant classic papers.
It's
so good.
It's a really important insight. But I would also point out, you said monogamy is rare.
In mammals. I said that. I was very clear.
Oh, I thought you just said it was rare.
Nope. In mammals, it's extraordinarily rare.
Right. It is not rare in birds, and this has everything to do, to the extent that you have the sense that monogamy is not evolutionarily favored. The reason that it's rare in mammals has to do with the way mammals reproduce, which causes males not to have high certainty of paternity because pregnancy is long, whereas bird eggs are fertilized right before the shell is put on, right before they are laid. And so a male bird, is in a much better position to know how likely it is that he is the father of any given egg. And in the case that males have high certainty of paternity, investing is favored, right? So in birds, we have something like 85% of species have some degree of monogamy, right? That can be inside of a season or it can be lifelong, monogamy is never perfect in these systems when we check genetically. But anyway, the point is actually selection favors monogamy when certainty of paternity is high. And it is the decrease in certainty of paternity in a mammal system that causes it to be the rare outcome.
Yeah. Okay. I've lost my mouse again, Zach, but if you would just show my screen for a moment and then see if you can return me to where I need to be. So this is the paper we've been talking about, Emlyn and Oring, published in 1977, Ecology, Sexual Selection, and the Evolution of Mating Systems. It's hard for you and me at this point to know how hard to access it actually is because it's sort of in our blood and has been for so long. But I think this paper always struck me. We ran into it first almost 2 decades after it was written, but has always struck me as so clear and so precise and concise and just brilliantly done that it's worth going to if you're interested in this kind of talk about sort of what ecological conditions, and for humans, ecological conditions can include the density of the city you live in and what kinds of resources are around you, might lead to different kinds of mating systems like monogamy versus polygyny.
Long as we're here, the simple thing you're looking for in that paper is females distribute themselves across a landscape based on the distribution of resources, which tends to drive them apart. That is to say, competition for food will cause females not to want to be foraging right next to each other. Now, the distribution of food can be patchy, which affects that, but basically, food competition drives females apart. Mm-hmm. Predator competition drives females together. Females space themselves based on the tension of these two parameters, and then males pick a strategy based on how females are distributed around the landscape and what their reproductive parameters are, which varies if they are synchronized in their fertility, asynchronous, concealed ovulation, etc. So,
unless you're a Jacana,
which I'm not.
Good. Okay, then we don't have to talk about them. Good. Or a fallow rope.
Right. I'm also not a fallow rope.
Yeah, I guess you're not.
Nope.
That's good. Can you comment on the Trump team's progress in Pennsylvania? It's getting weird, and everyone except Tim Pool and Cenk, I think it's Ungar, isn't it?
Cenk.
So, yeah, that's spelled weird, and his
Cenk.
name, how is it pronounced?
I think it's Cenk Uygur.
Okay. Is pretending it's not happening. I really can't. I have been ignoring it.
Yeah, I have to say I'm not following it. I agree with your first sentence. It's getting weird.
Yeah.
I have the sense that this is over, but obviously that's not exactly where we are.
Yeah. Contrarian, perhaps, but could the low threshold speed limit, the low posted speed limit that we talked about in the last hour, be a shape of institutional racism? For instance, New York's stop and frisk. 100%.
Oh yeah,
exactly right.
No, in fact, that was
what
the
we were trying to imply. Yeah.
In fact, I heard myself not include blacks as one of the categories of people you might choose to pull over because you're a son of a bitch. But
yep.
But yeah, of course.
Yeah,
that's a classic.
Yeah.
Right.
That's exactly it. It's one of the ways that a rule that's not bigoted allows bigoted people to enforce it in a bigoted manner. So how do we make rules and laws that preclude that from happening? That's tough, but it has to be done. We have to figure out how.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to get through a couple more. We got a $200 question here. We're going to get through.
Yep.
Oh, it's a different currency. Okay. Well, we're going to get through that one anyway because it's a good question. So 4 more here. How many plans are on hold for you all due to COVID? How is one to live without pursuing certain goals if COVID is closing off options? It seems too much to take in. More risk-taking? How do you make the best of it? I live alone right now, for context. I am about as introverted and capable of spending long periods of time alone as anyone I've ever met, having spent long periods of time nearly alone on an island off the coast of Madagascar, which is itself off the coast of Africa, for many, many, many months when I was doing my graduate research. And I cannot imagine how people are staying fully mentally healthy if they're living alone right now. It's really, really hard. And we are both so lucky to have the 4 of us who, as we said early, and it's still true, we have 4 people living together who not only love each other, but also continue to like each other. Plus we have 4 animals, non-human animals with whom we share a space, and we live in nature. And so that we can get outside, even at those moments when, God, stupidly early on the parks were closed, etc. So in that way, we are incredibly lucky, and we know that most people are not. Most people do not have that combination of things that are making this relatively easy. That said, this isn't easy. It's not easy at all. It's hard, and boy, we watched so many things that we had planned just fall off in March. The cancellation of, oh my God, we were supposed to go to New Orleans. We were supposed to go to Princeton to give a talk. We were supposed to go to, I was supposed to be at Princeton again this month, I think. We were supposed to go to Bucknell. There were all sorts of, we were supposed to be.
Britain.
Yeah. There were just all sorts of events that we were supposed to go to speak at, to be at. And that would have involved not just seeing more of the world, which, as we have said over and over and over again, is one of the, it's one of the joys of life, but it's also one of the ways to make sure that your model is not becoming out of date or provincial. But it's also one of the ways to meet so many people that you wouldn't otherwise have an opportunity to meet. So all of our lives are becoming more restricted, more provincial, because we're not able to do that anymore. That said, would we have chosen to start live streaming when we did? Had we not suddenly been in lockdown? I don't know. Very well, maybe not.
Yep.
In part, we saw what we perceived in late February and early March as such an abundance of bad information and terrible talking points and worldviews that were inconsistent internally with regard to COVID that we thought, we actually have some insight here. We're going to take the airwaves, as it were, and start talking about it. And I'm not sure what would have been the impetus absent that. So there are certainly also good things that have emerged for us. But at the moment, most of the plans that we would have had, most of the places we would have been going now, hadn't even made it to the calendar yet. So I mean, I'm sure this is true for most people who go places, who were invited to go places, that we had things in April, May, June, July, through now canceled, but no new plans have been made. And so who knows what the winter and spring could be looking like right now, absent the lockdowns. And one additional effect is that the publication date for our book has been delayed because in large part, apparently because of supply end delays in terms of paper and printing delays for the printers. And so, this book that was supposed to come out in the spring of 2021 is now going to come out in September of 2021.
Now, I will say,
which is both disappointing, but also maybe by that point we'll all be out from under this thing and we'll be able to actually travel and do, and do events around the book and maybe meet many of you who we otherwise wouldn't have met. But it's a clusterfuck.
Yeah, it's chaos. I will say, because of the way we've written the book, it will still remain true even given the delay.
Although, as you know, I went back in and I was like, well, we got to add something about COVID, don't we?
Right.
Like, oh boy.
Yep.
Yeah.
But I would say, look, there's a couple of things. One, this has been catastrophic at some levels. Two, as Heather points out, it has caused innovation. Three, there's diminishing returns on the innovation. The more months we go on like this, the less there is to be learned each month. Four, I'm concerned as hell that we are now botching the analysis of what's really in our collective interest, because this has now been so thoroughly politicized that we are not in agreement about what is taking place. And given what the consensus seems to be about what is taking place, we are not in agreement about what the rational policy response would be. We've got to get out of that situation. We've got to get to a place where we can actually talk cost benefit, deaths caused by lockdown versus deaths caused by not locking down. All these things have to be compared, and there's a way to do it, but we're just not doing it. We're playing team games instead.
Yep. What is your opinion on democracy in the workplace, e.g. worker co-ops? I'm not sure I would have thought of worker co-ops being democracy in the workplace per se.
Yep.
So I'm not sure exactly what the person is getting at. I think the worker co-ops that I'm most familiar with are food co-ops, which we've always been members of whatever food co-ops are wherever we live, and they seem to work really effectively. They tend to be small organizations with very left-leaning individuals who are therefore somewhat susceptible to ideological capture, and we've seen that long before the current moment. I think we even saw that in Ann Arbor, but we certainly saw it in Olympia.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say it works very differently for different kinds of organizations.
Yeah.
In a food co-op, at least for a while, it works in your favor. It results in, food that's less likely to be compromised by pesticides and other such things. And, it's going to increase the price. But in terms of the harm, if pesticides are not harmful, and there's no reason to think that would be the case, but if it was the case, it wouldn't hurt you to eat things that didn't have them. They're not like a nutrient. So, the bent of a food co-op tends to work in the direction of the health of the people who shop there. But as you point out, it can extend to other things, and we can start battling about, whether
they should divest from Israel.
Right. Or whether the, tortillas are culturally appropriative based on,
right,
who owned the shop that pressed them or whatever. So, there's a danger. But you scale this up, what does democracy look like in a larger entity? Well, frankly, it looks like, Penguin Canada having an allergic reaction to the publication of a book by a highly respected author who, I don't know what his second 12...
who's going to sell a huge number of books and is therefore good for the bottom line of the business on whom these people depend for their salaries.
Right. So anyway, obviously it should not be up to a bunch of employees who want to shut down certain schools of thought to decide what a publisher can publish. The answer is the publisher should publish things, frankly, that the publisher doesn't believe are true. It should publish them so that, if these arguments are viable, that we can have the debate about what they are. And in the case of Peterson, this is just so freaking insane. If you look at what his first 12 rules were, it's obviously in the interest of the well-being of the people that he's publishing the book for.
Allow me to take this moment to say publicly also that I have always stopped to pet cats when I see them on the street.
Yes, you have. Mm-hmm. You've been on that rule since the beginning.
Exactly. 2 more questions. Hi. From an evolutionary standpoint, what do you think is the most fundamental moral, that should be, or ethical rule of our society? For instance, is it the golden rule? Is it consent? My first thought reading this is that we have this list of 12 things that we say associate 12. I said 12. I said 12. I was thinking of the 12 days of Christmas, wasn't I? It's terrible. 8 things associated with the 8 nights of Hanukkah that have seemed fairly central to running a good and fair society, and they actually form the epilogue of our book. And one of them is, in fact, the golden rule, and no one of them is not consent, because it seems to me that consent is a sub-issue that as soon as you make it into a static rule, it's going to be gamed.
Yeah. So, certainly golden rule stands, it's a candidate. I would say that there's a deeper principle than all of it, but in some sense, I'm thrown by your asking from an evolutionary standpoint, because evolution is perfectly amoral, and there are places where we would absolutely reject what it wants for us. But the deepest one, I would say, is that life is an incredibly precious gift. Human life is the most amazing privilege a person can have, right? Not only do you get to live and experience life, but you also get to understand meaning and to live fully in a way that other creatures can't. There's some aspect of the experience that they don't have access to. So in any case, I guess my point would be, given what it is, it seems to me that we are morally obligated to see how many people we can give that experience. And while that will initially sound like a frightening argument in favor of large populations, it is in fact the opposite, because in order to give the maximum number of people the experience of being a human being who is liberated by sufficient well-being that they can dedicate themselves to things of true meaning, you have to live in a way that we do not degrade the planet as we go. And so the large number of people that we would give this experience would be a human population that could go on indefinitely, because we are being careful enough with the resource that we have been granted. So anyway, I think that's the highest principle is, are we working towards leaving this opportunity as good as we found it or better, so that as many generations of us can experience it as possible? And if we're not doing that, then we are falling down on our obligation to ourselves and to our lineage.
One more question, and then we will end for this week. What role do dreams play evolutionarily, and how does the mind quantify dreams prior to the knowledge of language?
Well, this is a funny one. I'm going to hold back a little bit, because there is a major theoretical puzzle piece to be put in place, and deep at the end of a Q&A doesn't seem the place to unveil it. But I will say, A, we know that dreams are widespread, that is to say, amongst creatures. B, we know what kinds of creatures seem to have dreams. It's a little hard to nail down exactly what's going on, because we don't read the brain that easily, but we've got a lot of correlative evidence that tells us that this happens. They are clearly adaptive, because they are expensive. To the extent that they are expensive, they have to be paying their freight and then some in order to have evolved. We have reason to think that they are convergently evolved multiple times. That's really interesting. So it suggests that the utility of dreams is large enough that it's been discovered in many different clades, or at least several different clades. And so anyway, the answer is, for some reason, the brain makes movies at night, One learns a lot about the type of movies. If you experiment with lucid dreaming, you'll discover a lot about your dreams. And there's certainly a tremendous amount of value in just simply trying to remember your dreams. There's often good stuff, obviously. Freud and Jung and many others have recognized the deep connection of these things to our capacities in our waking life. So anyway, yes, a deep evolutionary story is there to be unearthed, and it's connected to some very surprising other things. And stay tuned. We will get there as soon as possible. Hopefully the world will open back up and we can take some of these things into appropriate halls and give a decent presentation on it.
That's right. That would be wonderful. I look forward to that moment. Well, that is it for today, but let us reiterate a few things that are going on soon. Tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific, less than 24 hours from now, we will be doing our once monthly private Q&A, which you can get access to by joining at my Patreon. If you join at my Patreon, you will also get access to a 20% off code for our new merchandise shop, which is at teespring/store/dark-horse-podcast. If you don't join either of our Patreons, you can use the code THANKFUL, all caps, through Monday for 15% off. You can join Bret's Patreon or mine for access to a Discord server where people are having good conversations. And at Bret's Patreon, you can also, at higher monetary amounts, get access to conversations that he has on the first Saturday and Sunday of the month, which will be next weekend.
Would have been awesome.
Yeah, so actually the $100 one will be before our next live stream, right before our next live stream next Saturday.
Saturday, right. I will post I sent the promo code to my patrons yesterday, but I now realize if you joined now, you wouldn't see it. So that's a reason for me to post it rather than send it. So I will post it to my Patreon. So if you join my Patreon, you'll have access to it. Also, I don't know, like, subscribe, notify.
Yep.
Be well. Rock on.
Enjoy the end of November.
Yeah, enjoy the end of November. Why not? What else are you going to do?
Yes. Enjoy things while you can and get outdoors.
All right. Be well, everyone.